So, yes, you can. More cowbell. More cowbell. Yes, Christopher Walken. Oh. Hmm. All right. All right. All right. Are we ready to go, Kim? I can start? Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Well, Luna is handled for the time being, and so I have this brief moment of freedom. Um, she kept me up really late last night. I don't know why. Monsters, everything, you know. She's getting that age where she's starting to have like nightmares, stuff like that. So she runs in my room. If I seem a little bit off step, then it can be forgiven. Um, so so you caught me right in the middle of, for those of you who might be here for the first time or watching for the first time, we're on a series, Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage in the Bible, how it actually worked, the legal mechanics, the historical background of it. And as I said before, each presentation is cumulative, so I assume that based upon previous presentations, what we're talking about. And if not, you might want to go back and watch. Otherwise, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So I guess, is the camera up there? Or I don't know. It's right there. Okay. Hey. So anyway, so we stopped right here, and this was grounds for divorce in the Second Temple period. These were the ways that one could theoretically be unfaithful. So I'm pushing this button. It's not. Oh, it's off. Never mind. There we are. So this was a consensus view during the Second Temple period. The Qumran community, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, pretty much every sect in Judaism agreed with these. Neglect of food, neglect of clothing, which are part of the ketubah, prolonged willful withholding, cruelty, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, imposing an unattainable or unreasonable vow on one's wife, impotence and barrenness, renunciation of monotheism, and adultery or any other quote-unquote sexual indecency. And that has a very broad term, ervat davar. So as I said before, also in the time of the Second Temple period, people were beginning to think that, or the rabbis of the time held that if you suspected your wife of infidelity, or she flat out did infidelity, you must divorce her. You had to divorce her. It was compulsory, essentially. You couldn't forgive, if that makes sense. And that was sort of the standard operating procedure of the time. Now, as I said before also, and this bears repeating so many times, this was not the Iron Age anymore. The hangman wasn't hanging, okay? The Sanhedrin lost its execution prerogatives to Rome. And so for adultery, there was stigma, and you'd lose the dowry, and you might not ever get married again because you had a stigma on you, and there'd be shame, but there wouldn't necessarily be a stoning anymore. So I talked about some harsh vows and cruelty that were discussed. And if you guys want to see all the previous slides, we could go back into that. You guys can go back online, but I'm just going to speed ahead. So this is legitimate divorce for various reasons. Divorce for legitimate causes was generally accepted during the first century in the Common Era. But in the case of illegitimate divorce or get, the marriage still existed. The new union, any new union, was considered adultery, and any new offspring were quote-unquote mamzers. A woman could be condemned to a de facto life of loneliness and limbo as an aguna, or a bound woman, with a husband that wouldn't give a get, or maybe perhaps a get that was invalid. And so the get process had to be closely monitored. Either spouse, the husband or wife, could initiate divorce. The man could take the wife to the court, or vice versa. The wife could take the husband to the court. But the husband had to finalize it with the get. That was actually in the Torah. That's Deuteronomy 24, and there's no messing with that. So as women's rights ascended, Jewish courts could, even though it was voluntary for the man, they could strong-arm a man into giving a get. So they could impose lashing, fining, things of that nature, and make it really tough. Things they can't do today. So I would imagine they'd probably have a lot fewer husbands withholding on gets in the ancient world than they would today in a secular society where you can't enforce those things. The Beit Din back then had teeth. You know, they had a bailiff, which today they don't have a bailiff. That's the big difference.
Dragging you out into a public square and giving you some lashing in front of everyone.
Yes.
Would make you sign whatever piece of paper you need to sign.
Or just the threat of it, yes, of being unmanned in front of everybody. So, and whoever was the aggrieved party, they would receive the dowry for all their pains. So, there's two. Really, divorce and marriage stand on two verses. I mean, there's other verses that talk about it, stoning verses too, but really, it stands on two verses. So there's one in Exodus that talks about food, clothing, and conjugal rights, which we've gone over many times. And then there's the one in Deuteronomy 24. And this deals with the issue of, there's a lot actually in there. There's the issue of sexual indecency, the issue of giving a get and how to do it, and the fact that you can never remarry from a previous marriage if you had a second marriage. You can't go back ever again. And so there's a lot packed into that in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. And so that's to protect people from basically milking father-in-laws for their dowries. So if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, Deuteronomy 24, this is actually verse 1, not 1 through 4. When men took their wives to court, it was mostly under suspicion of adultery in the aegis of Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. The suspected woman was called a sotah, oftentimes, or a wayward woman. Owing to the old polygamy allowance, we've mentioned this many times, women could not charge a husband with adultery. Only a husband could charge a woman with adultery, or accuse. And adultery could only be committed against the cuckolded husband, as it were. He was the note holder of the marriage. Therefore, only husbands brought adultery complaints to the court. And as I said before, this is the complicating matter, and we have a lot of complicating matters throughout history. The complicating matter back then was, as I said, the Sanhedrin lost its teeth as far as execution power for adultery, and the public didn't really like it that much anymore anyway. And today, of course, living in the secular Western world, we have limited enforcement power because whether there's a Torah court or an there's a diocese, or a Sharia court in the U.S. or whatever you have, it's limited by the secular jurisdiction, which has supremacy. And so now people got around this with the bitter waters curse. Are you guys all familiar with the bitter waters ordeal? Okay, all right. Well, that was so people just kind of defaulted to that at this point. And so this ritual became overutilized because of so many husbands suspecting their wives of adultery that around 70, that's when Yochanan ben Zakkai suspended it. He suspended the ritual. The temple was about to be wrecked anyway, so. So over time, as I said before, divorce was viewed as compulsory. So it says here, in the case of one who warned his wife not to seclude herself with a particular man, and she subsequently secluded herself with that man, he must divorce her. He must divorce his wife. Mishnah Sotah 6:1. And so Matthew actually hits on this. Why then, they, the Pharisees, asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a get, a certificate of divorce, and send her away? And Yeshua replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, or I guess perhaps unrepentant, hard heart, unrepentant. But if it was not this way from the beginning. So here they're saying that, and they're going by the compulsory model, the Pharisees, that you must divorce your wife, whereas Yeshua is seeming to suggest that you can it's optional. You don't have to divorce your wife. You can forgive her, if that makes sense. Do you follow that? Okay. So this, of course, so Joseph himself was in a pretty hairy situation. He's suspecting Mary of being a sotah, but at the same time, It says in Mishnah Sotah 4:3, a woman who is pregnant by any other husband who died or divorced her, and a woman who is giving suck to a child by another husband, those women don't undergo the bitter waters ordeal. And so they were essentially exempt. And so Joseph is in a very tough bind because he really doesn't have an out. You know, he's suspecting his wife, and of course the Sanhedrin isn't stoning anymore. And then the one ritual that was supposed to either clear her name and give him some clarity on this is not available to him because, well, she's pregnant. And a Sotah who was pregnant was not subject to the bitter waters ordeal. So, as I said before, a proven adulteress forfeited her dowry, returned her to her parents in shame, assuming they would even take her back. So this woman might actually become homeless in kind of a charity case and a drain on the community. And so the school of Hillel would attempt to solve this quandary with their own kind of quick and painless solution. And so this is the other passage, not Deuteronomy 24, but Exodus 21:10 through 11. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the first wife's food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Let's see. So basically the Exodus passage centers around domestic needs, other than non-adultery infractions. And Deuteronomy, of course, deals with 24 deals with sexual indecency. Anyway, this passage started off as about a slave woman and a man taking a slave woman or a bondwoman. And the sages over time, using Kal Vachomer, light to heavy interpretation, they said, well, if a woman is a slave woman and she gets these rights, then shouldn't a free woman as well? And now that was how they interpreted that. So, any questions so far? Yeah, go ahead.
So the ordeal, the test,
Mm-hmm.
bitter waters test, obviously, do you think the reason why they didn't do it with women who were pregnant or already had given birth children, because there's no need for suspicion, because the proof is already there.
Yeah.
The test isn't it just to figure out?
Yeah.
It's like, I suspect, I don't know that you committed adultery, but I suspect it, so I'm going to make you take an oath before God and go through this test, and it proves out to be that you're shown to be guilty, and God's going to miraculously show that you're guilty.
I thought that, but at the same time, I'm wondering if maybe that she could counter-defend in court, saying, well, she could theoretically lie and say, well, we actually did sleep together, and then it would be sort of a he said, she said, and that's what the Sotah bitter waters ordeal would probably be trying to solve. So, but again, it's kind of moot because it becomes a defunct ritual. Now, for specific acts of neglect, especially on the husband's side, so the courts did something very interesting. They would intervene. They would try to save the marriage either through penalty or a counsel, anything of that nature. So they could impose fines, or they could actually alter the dowry. So for example, if I marry a woman and the dowry is 400 shekels, but she goes to the courts and said, my husband has been continuously neglecting his household. He's not providing food for us. We're starving. Look at I can count my children's ribs, et cetera, et cetera. The court might impose from 400 shekels, they might say, raise the dowry to 600 shekels. So that in case she ever gets a divorce out of him, or he divorces her, he now has to replenish not the 400, but the 600. And it can go the other way too. If the woman was being neglectful somehow in her spousal duties, they might lower it and say, well, it was 400, but now it's going to be 200. So it was a way to financially incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors. And it was pretty ingenious. I guess marriage counseling today would be a lot different if you had collateral on the line, and if your counselor could actually up and down, impose fines and penalties.
The rate per hour goes up.
Yeah.
The rate per hour goes down.
Yes, exactly.
Have you done your homework?
Yes, exactly.
Great. Half off this week.
Yes, exactly. But does that make sense? Essentially, a dowry, if you're a man, is something that you have to replenish. So you'd have to liquidate whatever assets you have or anything you might have spent and send it off. And so, let's see. Okay. So, and I've mentioned this before, actually Laura, when she was here, she asked about this. Now there are matters that are really commensurable. You can measure them, like 200 measures of food or so many pounds of clothing and textiles, things of that nature, shekels, dowries, you know. You can actually measure those with specific numbers. But when it came to neglect of, I guess, sexual, emotional, romantic obligations, the rabbis were a little bit more hesitant to grant a divorce. They would try to intervene for a lot longer, according to Brewer. They would try to take measures to save the marriage because essentially, you know, there's a fine line between I'm being neglected and I'm just not happy. You know, I'm just not happy. It could be for totally flaky reasons. And not only that, but again, how do you really measure love and how do you measure romance? Now, you could try, but maybe in instances, but.
There was one case that comes to mind right now that where a woman wanted to divorce her husband because he smelled bad. That was her main thing. He's like, he's a good husband, everything else, he just smells so bad. I cannot be married to this man. And the court actually told her that she should not be submitted to that torture. There was another case where
Oh,
the husband was a tanner.
Yeah.
And a tanner could, basically a woman could divorce a tanner if she could not stand his trade. Tanning leather was done in human excrements.
Yeah.
So that was essentially a
Yeah.
very difficult job to live with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hopefully. Maybe she
Ta-
didn't know what she was getting into. She was too young and inexperienced.
Okay, Tally's next.
I don't know what year you're talking about, maybe back then, but not too recently. In the last 10 years, they had a case that the woman cannot produce sons, and they grant them the divorce because of that, even though it's the man.
Yeah.
That determines
The DNA
that
comes from.
they
Yeah.
approved it because she didn't. It's only girls.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, back then they didn't have genetic testing. I guess you had to go by. Oh, he's got red.
No, in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
That was recently.
Yeah. I know. I heard the recent part, but I mean, coming from the, you know, on Jerry Springer, you can always have the paternity test, but you know, I guess back then it would be, you know, that's a redheaded stepchild. It doesn't seem to fit, you know. So in Israel, at the time of Yeshua, there were two great rabbinic houses, Hillel and House Shammai. Now, as you know, one is more lenient and one is more strict. Shammai tends to be a bit more strict and hewed to the traditional interpretations of the Torah, especially when it comes to marriage and divorce. So I think Ramona, you'd be House Shammai, probably, right? Yeah. Yeah, you'd be House Shammai. These are the good old days you're looking for, right? No? Yeah, you'd be, no, okay, all right. So, no, okay, all right. So, yeah. So, trials were often, as it says, were painful, public. They were a huge ordeal. So, in a town where gossip was very common and people were always relaying information about each other. Oh, I knew she was something else, you know, and you watch as the trial goes on, and it was an ordeal. And so witnesses would be summoned, charges proven, evidence brought, and dowries would be allotted to the wrong party. House Hillel devised this very outre divorce method called any cause, in which no proof or evidence was required, no case made, and the husband just gave the dowry to the woman. I don't want the dowry, I don't want to fight over it, and I give her the get. Now, Hillel at this time comprised the majority of courts, but both courts were scattered all throughout the land. Plaintiffs, now this is interesting, had the liberty to select the venue. So you could pretty much hop on a donkey and go wherever you wanted, and if you felt that this court would be more favorable to me than this court, or so vice versa. And so, now this is something actually very interesting. Do you know what the full faith and credit clause in the U.S. Constitution is? Full faith and credit clause. Okay. All right. What? Somebody said it?
States.
Oh yeah. Basically, what somebody binds or loosens in one state is honored by another state, essentially. And it keeps conflicts from erupting. Yeah, yeah. And so that's essentially it. And it's a constitutional matter. So there was acrimony between both houses, Hillel and Shammai. That is true from the historical record. But despite that, for all their acrimony, for all their anger, for all their disputes, they had amongst themselves, these courts, there were Hillel courts and Shammai courts, they had a mutual recognition pact. So if there were a marriage that came from a Hillel court, Shammai court would recognize it, and vice versa. And if there were a divorce that came from a Hillel court, Shammai court would recognize it, and vice versa. Can anybody guess why they did this, practically? Peter?
Because it would be a mess if things didn't be anarchy.
Oh yeah, it would essentially be anarchy. So you would have a situation where
Legal divorce, because somebody will say it's not legal.
yeah, so half the country might be telling you your divorce isn't legal and you're still married to your other spouse and your new kids are mamzers and you're in adultery with this new relation. So it would cause a huge systemic collapse if they didn't have this mutual recognition pact. There was no other way. And so this is something very important to remember, especially when the disciples say to the master in Matthew, better not to marry. People have often thought that that's about their personal marriages. Oh, it's hard. I better not to marry. No. It's about something else, and we'll get to that. Yeah. It's for no court may set aside the decision of another court unless it is greater in wisdom and in number. So that's the precedent right there for full faith and credit back in ancient Israel.
Okay.
So, yeah. Anyway, so this is the Shammai court typically, the traditional list that I showed you earlier. Plus, adultery and everything, and indecency. Now, this is where it starts to get kind of interesting. Divorce rationale in a Hillel court, any cause divorce. I don't think it's a really good interpretation or translation. I think it should be no cause divorce is probably how it should sound, because essentially nothing had to be proven. They just skipped over that proceeding entirely. They just skipped over proving that she burned the toast, or she was with another man or whatever, and they just said, okay, there's no contest. I don't want the get. I don't want the dowry. I don't want the nedunya. Just let her have it. I want her gone. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent in her, and he writes her a get, gives her to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house becomes a wife of another man, and the second husband hates her, now this is interesting, displeased versus hates. Displeased, there's a cause. Hates, remember I told you he hated her and divorced her was the terminology for no cause? That's right there. So these are two distinct. And so that means that that means that if he hates her and divorces her, she has a dowry. So the first husband wants to marry her and have two dowries. So you can't do that. You can't parlay your winnings. And so that's what this is based off of. But this term, it's kind of grammatically awkward. It's often translated as, it's ervat davar. It means, it's often translated as indecency. I think literally means something like in ancient Hebrew, the nakedness of a matter, or the indecency of a matter. Yeah, so it's used in the previous chapter when God tells the Hebrews to relieve themselves outside of the camp and cover it up, because it's called ervat davar, just as well. So it's not necessarily adultery, it's anything indecent, if that makes sense. It has a much wider gamut than adultery. So when Yeshua is saying, a man may not divorce his wife except for, and he's hearkening back to this verse, ervat davar, it might be many more things than just adultery. Hillel uses this, let's see, Hillel reads it in a very novel way. They say that they read it as indecency or a matter, not indecency of a matter. And again, it's very grammatically loose in ancient Hebrew. And so they would say basically indecency or anything else. So like without qualification. And so Shammai reads it in the way Yeshua reads it, you know, indecency of a matter, or just one thing, you know, sexual indecency. So that's where Hillelite divorce is born. Just how you translate this. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a very simple way sort of to understand the debate between Hillel and Shammai on this. They took the same phrase, but one of them stresses one word and the other one the other. So am I stressing the matter or am I stressing the indecency? And depending which one you favor, that one sort of say goes to the forefront. And that gives you sort of say the legal precedence to move in that direction or another direction. That's why they're so different. Because if it's the matter, matter is a thing. It's anything and all things.
Yeah.
So that basically creates an opportunity for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
And that's where the other just says no, it has to be specifically some sort of a indecency, or as Hebrew says, nakedness. The ancient Hebrew word is nakedness. So it has to do something with that. And if it's not something with that, then all other matters don't really play into that. So it's like, which word are you going to stress in that phrase determines how you're going to decide.
Now, Hillelite divorces, they've been knocked a lot, but they have some merit to them. I don't agree with them, but they have some rationale as to why. They've just been sort of made the villain of the marriage stories in the Bible. And so I'm trying to show both sides. So this is a big thing to unpack. The school of Shammai says a man should not divorce his wife except if he found indecency in her, as it says, for he found in her an indecent matter. And the school of Hillel said, even if she spoiled his dish, it says any matter. See, that's what you're saying. Yeah, the school of Hillel said to the school of Shammai, since it said matter in Deuteronomy 24:1, why did it also say indecency? And since it says indecency, why did it also say matter? Because if it says matter and did not also say indecency, I would say she who is discharged because of a matter is permitted to remarry, but she who is discharged because of an indecency may not be permitted to remarry, and do not be surprised, blah, blah, blah. If she is forbidden to marry him, her first husband, who has been permitted to her, why should she not be permitted? So it gets very complicated. But basically, Hillel is making the case that by stressing the word matter, we are allowing a woman who is indecent, or for any other reason as well, to remarry, essentially, is the idea. So it might be, we're doing this to try to prevent an aguna, is the case that he's making. And so this is the Hillelite divorce court. So I had some virtues. Since there was no cause, the woman immediately pocketed the dowry. So no victimhood of women here. 2, a sotah was spared from destitution in the public dole. And so at this time, when there was a woman who was suspected of adultery, people would encourage a man to go the Hillel route, because if not, we're all going to have to take care of this woman. Your problem is going to become our problem. Seriously, she'd become on the public dole. And so everybody kind of knuckled down on this one particular guy to just do the right thing and give her a Hillelite divorce, on any cause or no cause. Hillelite courts were also closed from the public and discreet, guarding the dignity of the accused. Joseph, for instance, wanted to put Mary away quietly. So the divorce that he would have been using was a Hillelite divorce. Now, it says that he was righteous. Wait, I thought all people that used Hillelite divorces were sleazy and wife swappers and all these terrible people, but yet it says that he's righteous. Because he's basically saying, I'm suspecting you did something to humiliate me, but I don't want you to be humiliated in a public Shammai court, and I want you to keep the dowry. So he's being very lenient with her, given the circumstances, because he was righteous. So could it be that there might be legitimate usages of the Hillelite divorce, and maybe Yeshua was simply against their abuse? Possibly. I don't know. Now, the kiddushin, or the engagement, required a get to break off. It's also important to note. So he's in the kiddushin phase right now of or I guess he's not fully married to her yet. They haven't had the ceremony. But he's promised to her, so he would have had to give her a get just as well. Even if you were betrothed, you still had to give a get if you were going to break it off. And so To avoid frivolous divorces, the any cause get process was fraught with intricate hurdles. So they would make the get process extremely difficult, the Hillelite courts. They would make it extremely complex and complicated in order to discourage people. Like, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? And they do that. And Hillel makes the case that the interpretation allows any woman who's either been indecent or done any other matter to remarry. And so it prevents, according to the school of Hillel, agunot. So that's definitely good. So here's something interesting. This is in the Iron Age, or the Bronze Age. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent, elvat davao, about her, and he writes her a get, it's like, wait a minute. Why is this indecent woman even allowed to live, let alone remarry? Why is she allowed to live, let alone remarry? Because it's probably not about adultery or just adultery at all. It could be any matter of sexual indecency. Because at the time that this is written, there was only one prescription for a woman who commits adultery, and that was clear. It is either the bitter waters ordeal or a stoning. And so if she'd either be cleared, and or her name would be vindicated, or she would die. And yet it's describing her going on and remarrying another man, and oh, by the way, you can't remarry your old wife, and blah, blah, blah. So it's suggesting essentially that this elvat davao probably means something other than, or might include adultery, but might mean a lot of other things too. And so, go ahead.
Is that for both houses ascribed to this?
This being what?
Meaning this being the verdict of what happens if
Well,
she is found.
Well, I'm asking you in Deuteronomy 24. Everybody always assumes that this indecency is adultery.
Right, which means capital punishment.
Capital punishment is the only solution for that.
Not unless you have witnesses.
Yeah, but if you don't have witnesses, you give her the bitter waters ordeal. That would be the. And so there's not really a lot of things that you can. There's not really a lot of outs that she has, but it's just describing casually this woman who did something indecent, going on and remarrying. And so it's like, well, it probably isn't about that verse in Deuteronomy 24. Probably isn't about adultery or only adultery. It could be flirting or secluding oneself with other men. It could be violating the laws of Nida. It could be a whole bunch of different things that are bad. So. It's a very wide word, and it's probably in the New Testament is translated as, you'd see it as porneia or something like that. They'd use that word for it in Greek. So now, it's interesting because of the different needs of men versus women. Women would often pick the Bet Shammai courts, and the men would often pick the Bet Hillel courts. Okay, the Bet Shammai would often deal with things proven in public, openly. Not only that, but neglect. He's not providing for me in various different ways, and this would be the matter that would be at hand. And so it was less popular overall, but it was the chosen venue of women to take their husbands to court. Bet Hillel, it was the chosen venue of men in the case of either adultery, sexual jealousy, suspected adultery, that kind of thing. And so, but does that make sense to you as to why? Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm not going to go through all this because this is basically, I diagrammed out, this is nerd stuff, how the case would go. What if, yeah, it's Boolean logic, a little bit of set theory. And so with the husband, this is, you can look at this online, take a screen, pause it, pause it, yeah. And so, and how things would go, and pause it. So anyway, but this is the much more streamlined Hillel divorce. See? Less complicated. Well, still quite a few steps. So anyway, I just want to point out that, and I have to repeat this. Shidduchin erusin. This is the early mutual commitment from both families. that these kids were going to marry. Kiddushin was the actual engagement. The bridegroom gives the gift to the woman and makes a promise. And then these are the conditions, and the nisuin. And this is the marriage consummation. So this is about where Joseph and Mary are. So he would have had to issue her a get in a Hillel court to do what he wanted to do, to protect her name and not have her humiliated. So anyway, this is something interesting I found out in Talmud Eruvin and Even HaEzer. This deals with child custody arrangements. It was a thing, child custody arrangements. Custody of all children under the age of 6 was to be given to the mother. Talmud Eruvin 82a, Ketubot 65b. Custody of boys over the age of 6 were to be given to the father, Even HaEzer. And custody of girls over the age of 6 was to be given to the mother. And so, and I actually read something kind of humorous in one of the writings. It said, well, when the child is old enough to use the latrine and wipe himself, then that's their metric of when you can. But by default, they typically go with the mother up until the age of 6, at which point the father has the claim on the son, because back then the son is kind of like your right hand, you know. Well, is that the son is like your right hand, and so they were loath to deprive a father of his son. And the Talmud Ketubot 59b assumes that both parents have the means and desire to keep these children in this model. As per Shulchan Aruch and Maimonides, Jewish law further stipulates that after divorce, women are under no obligation to financially support or maintain a child, which I think that would probably be rare. One pekuach nefesh, to save a life exception, would be if the child is suckling or somehow dependent on the mother in a way that would be fatal if there were separation. And so they had a whole playbook for this too. Child custody is not just a modern thing. So let's see, I can probably, the Gemara asks, until when are they considered very young? Until the age of 6, in accordance with the opinion of Rav Asi. Rav Asi said, the 6-year-old minor may go out by means of his mother's eruv, if she prepared an eruv on one side of the city. He is included in his mother's eruv rather than that of his father, as he is considered subordinate to his mother. And the daughter is with her mother forever, even after 6 years, in Even HaEzer. And then, of course, it mentions this. This is more proof of prenup. So the father might end up having to take care of the child based upon the stipulations of the initial marriage contract as well. So, okay. So I'll just skip it. Yeah.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you think this plays the role of why Judaism today is saying that if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish, but if your father's isn't?
I think that was probably more due to battlefield rape. When foreign armies came in, these mothers were left with babies they could potentially hate, and so the Jewish authorities were like, well, we'll make sure that this doesn't become a problem and just make it matrilineal. That seems to have been the historical cause for matrilineal lineage. So the aguna. Now, this was a pitfall during the time of Jesus. So if your get was off by one misspelling, one iota, one incorrect date, maybe the wrong emperor was written on your get, the year of the emperor was incorrect, the get would be invalid. And so, this is an area, the term legalist, I think oftentimes is used as a brick by Christianity to sort of throw at Jews. But in this case, I think it applies. Because you could have a woman's get invalidated on the base of, just a jot and tittle, basically. And she would be an aguna, she'd be in limbo, and if she had a new marriage, she'd be in adultery, and her kids would be illegitimate. Now, if she lost her get, oh yeah, I mentioned that, okay. Furthermore, in a Hillel court, a woman who did not violate her ketubah could be divorced against her will for no good reason. And if subsequently the get proved invalid, she would be an aguna. So that'd be a double whammy. So she had no guarantee of recovering a valid get, having her husband or ex-husband write a second get. And so, and it's even a problem today. In 2011, the editors of the Jewish Week reported, in Israel, estimates of 10,000 agunot have been reported by the Wall Street Journal and Jerusalem Post to this day. So that is bound women. So you might be divorced in the secular court according to the secular state, but it would be important to you if you're Orthodox, if you're a thinking person, that you want to be divorced before your Creator as well, not just according to the people that don't care. Proof of death. Another hazard at the time was abandonment or disappearance of the husband. If a husband died while on a journey, his widow would be left without proof of death or a get, rendering her an aguna. If he had a proof of death, like here's the guy, he's dead, no get was needed because he's dead. We can see him, he's right there. For this reason, a mindful husband would often grant a conditional get to their wives before war or travel, allowing her to remarry without a proof of death. So the dilemma, the Torah states that children born of adultery are mamzers. So wouldn't this taint and cut off the Davidic line with Bathsheba as illegitimate? Afterward, we have Solomon, you have this adulterous relationship. And here's what the sages say. It's like, well, this is why technically they're trying to explain, and I think continually defend the Davidic line and say, okay, David got away. David wasn't executed. He didn't die or anything like that. And the line remains intact because of this reason. Anyone who goes to war waged by the royal house of David, and this is Talmud Ketubot, writes a conditional bill of divorce for his wife. This was done to prevent a situation in which the wife of the soldier would be unable to remarry. Therefore, she, Bathsheba, was not forbidden to David, technically. Supposedly, they're saying that Uriah had written her a battlefield get. So I don't know. That might be some retrojection on the rabbi's part. I have no idea, but I think that there's a possibility for that. That if that were a thing at the time. So. Now there's blackmail and refusal. A Jewish woman can be granted a secular divorce in an American or Israeli court, but she would want to be truly free before God. Since according to the Torah, a husband must grant the get, this puts him in a position to blackmail his spouse or withhold it indefinitely out of spite. Yet given the secularization of the West and Israel, modern Beit Din civil enforcement power, the modern Beit Din lack the civil enforcement powers they once possessed, to fine and lash and so forth. So they can't offer the help that they once did to the woman who wants her get. So there's something called the Lieberman Clause in conservative Judaism. Jewish Theological Seminary of America professor Saul Lieberman devised a temporary solution to this problem with the so-called Lieberman Clause. This is a clause inserted into the ketubah. Upon get refusal, it stipulates rabbinic arbitration and will likely order the husband to pay a get. But again, Orthodoxy says that this is very, very sketchy, and they don't accept it, even though the conservative Judaism does, because they would make the claim that if you do this and if you go this route, then you're basically going to have to go beg a secular court to enforce it. And so they feel that that's kind of passing the buck. And therefore, to my understanding, the Lieberman Clause is only accepted in more liberal Judaisms to this day. That's one way out. And here's another. 9/11 presented a modern get dilemma because you had some Jewish people that were killed on 9/11, but you don't have a body. How could you? Everything was vaporized, And so the Beit Din of America decided they were going to rescue these women from agunot status. So in Yevamot, they say that if a man, Yevamot 21a says that if a man is lost in Ma'im Sha'in Lachem Sof, waters that have no visible boundary, that is, like if a man is lost in the ocean and you can see the horizon, and you can't see any other boundaries, then you might presume him alive. He might be possibly alive. But if you're like at a lake and you can see the edges all the way around, and you can see that he didn't come out, and you can see the edges, then you can presume that he's dead. And so they said, well, because this is a precinct, ground zero, and we know that it has boundaries, then under Yevamot 121a, we can assume that even though there's no body, that the husbands are presumed dead. And so all those agunot were released by the Beit Din of America from their status. Thank goodness. And so interesting little halakhic judo. So what?
It needed to happen. This is a real legal issue, so to say, for the court.
Yeah.
Because people have to understand a lot of the divorce law and things like that we're studying through. discussions that we're talking about, like even the Lieberman cause, you know.
Yeah. Now, something really kind of funny, an anecdote. There was a Jewish man who was converting, he was leaving the Jewish faith and converting to Catholicism. And this is mentioned on My Jewish Learning, I think. And this rabbi was going through different annulment cases. And he was also marrying into the Catholicism as well. So it was 2 for 1, this deal. And but out of spite, or maybe because he maybe accepted replacement theology, gets are stupid now, you know, he wouldn't give his ex-wife, his Jewish wife, a get. And so he left her in Aguna. And so the Beit Din summoned him and said, look, you got to give her a get. And he said, make me. You know, secular laws, you know, you can't do anything. So they went to the local diocese of this Catholic church, spoke to the prelate, and explained to him what a get was and the pitfalls of gets and the situation that this woman was in. After which the bishop summoned this apostate Jewish man in and said, you're not going to convert and you're not going to marry here until you give her a get. Yeah. Make it right. And in Catholicism, they can kind of enforce these things because it's like you're banned in the whole franchise, not just at this cathedral, but it's not like Protestantism where you can just drive down the road and you reestablish yourself. Everybody has an APB out for you, and so. I actually, some good news. I spoke to, I reached out about a month ago to one of the many Beit Dins in the United States. And well, actually a dozen of them, and one of them just got back with me about a week ago. And so I was surprised. And they have a big caseload, and he was asking me, like, why are you wanting to know all this? This is very obscure stuff. And it's like, this is intellectual curiosity. I'm not fishing for legal advice. Trust me, I'm already divorced. That would be besides the point, you know. And so we'll probably be talking this Sunday. So anyway, that is... that's it. And so I have some questions. I don't know if we have time. So what? Bring them on. Okay. So I think I'm going to tackle this the next time. What would Yeshua consider halakhic divorce grounds today? What would he consider halakhic divorce grounds today? And that's not. This is rhetorical. You don't have to answer that right now. I just want you to kind of meditate on that. Because in the next section, we're going to talk about just that. In the words of the Master, what was his opinion about divorce and remarriage? And what the valid grounds for it would be. Because that's ultimately probably what you want to hear. That's where the rubber meets the road. So the next two would be about that. Maybe a little bit of Paul thrown in there as well. And so, would the Master condemn his father, Joseph, for a Hillelite divorce if he went through it? If Yeshua considered Hillelite any cause divorce illegitimate, would he deem his parents agunot, if it came to that? Would Yeshua expect women and men to remain agunot if they couldn't properly certify a divorce? You know, some people become eunuchs for the kingdom. Is prenup unbiblical, as many pastors often say? Why does Christianity, there's misspellings here, I write these late. Why does Christianity, or why do Christianity and MJ rely on the state? This is what I want to leave you with. Why is it that MJ and Christianity both, I guess for whatever reason, because a lot of people come from it, why is it that you marry in the religious community and in the secular state, but you only get divorced in the secular state? Why is that? Anybody? Thoughts?
One reason the marriage certificate is a legal document filed with the county.
Yeah, I understand that. But coming from the perspective of the agunot, the Israeli women that are Orthodox, they don't care a whit what the state says. They care what Hashem says. You know, and so there seems to be this weird thing, and I've seen it before. I think a lot of people might have seen it before, where you have a couple, their marriage is totally on the skids. They're in big trouble. All this counseling has failed, and they depart from, let's say, their church, their local church, and they go off for a while to get divorced. Okay, So they were married in the state and in the church. But then the church kind of just lets them go off to the state, which, it's funny because you have this church's big repository of conservatives. And they say, well, we don't agree with the state. The state will marry you to a dolphin. And, the state doesn't have our values. It doesn't have our back on anything. And yet they'll sort of let the state be kind of the silent executioner and farm it out to them. And then maybe this couple comes back, now no longer husband and wife, and the church just kind of recognizes it without formally saying it, that they're no longer together. Go ahead.
Well, just off the top of my head, I would say that divorce is anathema, and that the church doesn't want to choose between the two parties. But it's also a lack of courage to take care of the matter and to take responsibility for that. In the Catholic Church, there is a very intensive process to annul a marriage, where the history of the marriage, the entire history, all the acquaintances and relatives and everybody, very personal questions are asked and answered before an annulment is granted. So they do have that in the Catholic Church.
Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo actually talks about annulments, that back in the day, the sages of Israel, if they suspected a child would become a mamzer, declared a mamzer, they would try to go back and retroactively declare the husband and wife's marriage invalid to spare that child from being a mamzer. And so that actually is a very old practice. It didn't start with Catholicism, but I think a lot of religion. Go ahead.
Drake, one other thing, we were taught this in church, that the verse that Paul used, being subject to the authorities. So when Mary and I got married, of course, we were told, file your marriage license with the county, and down the road is for some reason, will contesting or something like that come up.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically just kind of this paradox of modernity. There's always a complicating variable thrown in it, where at the time of Yeshua, the Sanhedrin didn't have the right to execute adulteresses anymore. That became a problem. Then today, religious courts just don't have the enforcement that they once did to be able to. Go ahead.
So I have, since you brought the Catholics into this conversation, that just complicates the whole matter to me, because you are dealing with theology that sees marriage as a sacrament. If you understand what sacrament is, it's something that brings you close to God. It's a means of redemptive, sort of work in your life.
Yes.
So how you get saved, per se, how you get close to God, is get married.
Well,
that's one of the ways, right? So if this is what you believe, if that's what you firmly hold to, then to break that up is a problem, which is why Catholic Church does not do divorce.
At all.
We can't undo.
We can't undo a baptism. We can't undo a priestly ordination. We can't undo. A sacrament has the status in Catholicism as like a decree from the throne that can't be undone. So baptism, for example, or infant baptism maybe, I don't know. Priestly ordination, funeral rites. These are all things, there's 7 of them, I think, and they cannot be undone ever because they're from the throne. And I think Catholicism kind of painted itself in a corner, really, because they ended up saying, well, we'll just go back and, go ahead. Go ahead.
So what do you mean by a decree from the throne? Are you talking about the church's authority?
Well, my understanding, a sacrament is not, we throw the word sacrament around, but it means something very specific in Catholicism. It doesn't mean to Protestants, and it doesn't mean to other religions. It means something that God did or put in place or instituted that can never be undone. Well, humans can be the medium.
It's not necessarily a human, an authority thing to me, as someone who grew up Catholic. I think it's sacrament means something that is made holy, that is done before God, that is, an anointing of, something like more on those lines. I probably don't have the right words. And the interesting thing is that in an annulment, the Catholic Church will also determine which party, if either or both or neither, can get married again. You can grant the annulment and say you cannot get married again. because of, for various reasons, but one party may get married again, the other party actually has a character, mental, or psychological defect that makes them incapable of marriage.
Sure. Yeah. I know. If, for example, in ancient Israel, if a woman or man had an affair, and of course they weren't stoned at this time, at the time of Jesus, and the stigma came, and they were punished, and dowries, and all the things happened in the court. Judaism forbade these two paramours from ever getting married. It's like, you're never going to get married after what you did. So you couldn't hedge your bets. Okay. Well, we'll call it off, and some things, just really kind of meditate on this. Why does Christianity and MJ rely on the state for divorce? Meditate on that. And so, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.